Hello and welcome to the Creepy Chronicles channel. Before we get started with today's spine-tingling stories, just 20% of viewers of our videos currently subscribe, so I would like to ask for your help by doing so. Your subscription would enable us to continue producing more of these terrifying stories for you. Thank you so much for your support. Now sit back, relax, and enjoy the video if you dare. The Permanent Resident. I've been a hearse driver in this small Vermont funeral home for over 15 years, and during that time, I've learned to perform my duties with respect and care, never letting superstition or ghost stories influence me. However, one night changed everything for me, a night that still makes me question everything I thought I knew about death. It was a foggy evening, the kind where the mist envelopes the streets like a cold embrace. It was late December, when the chill of the season seemed to permeate every nook and cranny of our small funeral home in Vermont that I end this line of work. You learn not to ask too many questions, so I didn't give much thought to the rumors that the family's insistence on having the transport done at night was unusual. Most people prefer to schedule such things during the day, but they were adamant. So I found myself driving through the dark streets in the dead of night. I had just finished a complex service that involved transporting the casket of a woman who had died under strange circumstances. The locals whispered that her husband had discovered her in the living room sitting on the couch with a look of pure terror frozen on her face. Something odd happened on my way back to the funeral home. There was something or someone sitting in the back of the hearse, exactly where the casket had been. I gripped the steering wheel, my hands getting clammy with sweat at first. I assumed it was just a fog playing tricks on me. But as I continued to drive, I came to understand that these weren't just shadows. They seemed to shift and flicker in the rear-view mirror, faint and fleeting. The feeling of being watched was unmistakable. And every time I looked at the mirror, that shadowy figure seemed to get clearer. My rational mind attempted to brush it off as a trick of the light or my own fatigue after a long day. Even though I couldn't see its face, I could feel its relentless, piercing eyes on me. I tried to concentrate on the road, telling myself it was all in my head. But the shadow in the rear-view mirror remained there motionless, as if it were observing me. When I finally arrived at the funeral home, I parked the hearse as quickly as I could, my hands shaking as I turned off the engine and stepped out. The night was eerily silent, and my chest tightened with fear. Every instinct told me to stop the hearse and check, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. The kind of silence that makes every little sound loud of the same casket I had just delivered to the cemetery was sitting in the center of the room, sealed and resting on its stand surrounded by half-melted candles that the F family had left behind. I blinked, certain that I was seeing things, and took out my phone to check my messages. Normally, there would be slight sounds inside, like the hum of a radio, footsteps from the embalming room, or the whisper of co-workers. But that night, everything was quiet. Finding one from the cemetery caretaker confirming that the casket had been buried earlier that evening. But here it was impossible to ignore sitting, as if it had never left my pulse racing as I slowly approached it. I considered opening the lid to confirm what I already knew. But before I could touch it, a sound stopped me in my tracks. It was a soft laugh, almost a giggle, but it sent a chilling wave of terror through my body. The sound came from deeper in the funeral home, and I turned toward it, my legs shaking, and walked down the dark hallway leading to the embalming room. The door slightly jarring it, and I heard a slight movement inside. Using what little bravery I had left, I pushed the door open, but what I saw when I did so stopped me cold. A young girl was sitting on the embalming table. Her long, dark hair hung limply over her shoulders, and she was dressed in an old, dirty white dress that appeared to have been worn while playing in the mud. Her tiny feet hung off the edge of the table, swinging slightly, and she appeared completely at ease. However, what really frightened me were her eyes, which were hollow, lifeless, and devoid of any humanity. I swallowed hard when I asked the girl, "What are you doing here? Are you lost?" In a barely audible whisper, she didn't answer. Instead, she cocked her head slightly as if she was observing me. Her deliberate, almost mechanical movement sent a new wave of chills through my body as she slowly raised one hand and pointed toward the mirror on the wall. I turned my head toward the mirror, afraid of what I might see, and my stomach dropped when I saw that it wasn't the embalming room reflected in the glass, but rather the interior of the hearse with its back doors open and the casket inside with the lid off. And I could plainly see that I was the one lying inside. The girl was no longer on the table, so I frantically searched the room, but she was nowhere to be found. My breath came in short panic gasps as I tried to make sense of what had just happened before I could move. I was wearing a black suit, my hands folded neatly over my chest and my eyes closed. I looked like a corpse ready for a funeral. The blood drained from my face as I stumbled backward, almost tripping over a chair. When I looked back at the mirror, the standard view of the embalming room had replaced the reflection. Before I could react, she whispered in a soft, eerie voice, "It's not a mistake. Take you're not supposed to be here." Her words felt like a dagger in my chest. So I yanked my arm free and staggered out of the room, my heart thumping in my ears. I felt something cold tug at the sleeve of my jacket, paralyzed with fear. And there she was again, the girl, gripping my sleeve tightly. The funeral home's atmosphere felt oppressive, as if the walls were closing in on them. Desperate to escape, I hurried back to the main hall, but when I arrived, the casket was gone. I stood frozen, staring at the empty space where it had been only moments before. My mind raced, trying to make sense of everything, but nothing added up. The laughter, the girl, the reflection in the mirror, it all felt like a nightmare. I turned around expecting to see the girl again, but there was no one there. The only sounds were the faint rustle of the wind outside and my own labored breathing, which made me unable to stay in the building any longer. I couldn't wake up from the sound of tiny footsteps echoing behind me, dragging me out of my reverie. My hands trembled as I pulled the doors wide half, expecting to see the casket inside again, but it was empty. A moment of relief passed, but it didn't last long, as a soft giggle reverberated through the quiet night from somewhere deep in the parking lot shadows. I grabbed my keys and ran out to the hearse, which was sitting under the pale moonlight with its back doors closed as if nothing had happened. Without turning around, I slammed the door and climbed into the hearse and drove quickly out of the funeral home. That was my last night working at the funeral home, and even now, years later, I can't get rid of the memory of that girl or her terrifying words. Sometimes at night, when I'm by myself, I hear faint laughter or feel the ghost of her icy grip on my sleeve. The following day, I tried to explain what had happened to my co-workers, but they laughed it off and blamed it on stress or exhaustion. Nevertheless, one of the older staff members pulled me aside and said quietly, "You're not the first to see her. She's been here for years." I stay away from mirrors whenever possible because I'm afraid of what I might see reflected back, because I know deep down that night wasn't the end, and I worry that she's still out there, waiting for me in the shadows. The strange ritual. I can still clearly recall the day that my life took a drastic turn. It was a cold autumn night, and the streets were eerily silent, broken only by the occasional murmur of the wind. I was on call, and I was 23 years old. I had recently landed a job at a small funeral home on the outskirts of town. It wasn't my first job, but it was by far the strangest. I always thought of myself as a practical person, unbothered by things that might disturb others. Death, at least in theory, was just part of life, a cycle we all have to face, but there was more to it than that. Even though it wasn't my first time traveling at night, there was something about this call that unnerved me. Maybe it was a woman's voice, which was shaking and almost scared. "Please don't take too long," she said before hanging up. When I got to the house, it was an old, run-down building with narrow windows that seemed to stare back at me. I knocked on the door, but nobody answered. It was a little jarring. After a moment of hesitation, I went inside and said, "Hello, is anyone here?" But all I got back was the echo of my own voice. A shiver went down my spine as I closed the back doors. The air was heavy, filled with the smell of dampness, and something else I couldn't quite identify. In the middle of the room, on an old couch, lay a man's body covered in a white sheet. I thought there was no one else in the house, so where was the family? However, something inside me told me not to stay too long. I worked quickly and carefully, placing the body onto the stretcher and wheeling it out to the hearse, and I was the only one who noticed. At that moment, I felt a strange pressure in the air, as if something invisible had filled the space inside the hearse. I instinctively looked at the rear-view mirror, and what I saw froze me in place, sitting upright on the stretcher, where the body should have been. The old man's face was clearly visible. His sunken, lifeless eyes were fixed on me. But the worst part was his grotesque, almost alive smile. I slammed on the brakes, and the car skidded slightly on the road, and my heart was racing as I turned to face the back, hoping it was all in my head. But when I looked, I saw nothing. The body was still there, wrapped in the sheet, exactly as I had left it. I tried to calm myself by running a trembling hand over my face, but I knew deep down that it wasn't true. I resumed driving, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. I tried not to look in the mirror, but it was impossible. Every few seconds, my eyes darted back in fear of seeing that figure again, but this time, instead of the body sitting, the old man was leaning forward as if attempting to approach the driver's seat. His lifeless eyes were still on me, and his horrifying smile had widened even more. I slammed the brakes even harder, this time bringing the hearse to the side of the road with a violent jolt. My heart felt like it was going to explode as I stumbled out of the car, almost tripping and running to the back and opening the rear doors. I slammed the doors shut and leaned against the hearse, breathing deeply to steady myself. "I can't do this," I muttered under my breath, but I had no choice. I had to finish the job. For the remainder of the drive, I kept the radio off and avoided looking at the rearview mirror. My hands were shaking, and the body was still there, wrapped neatly in the white sheet. Completely still for what seemed like an eternity, when I eventually pulled into the funeral home's lot, I felt a wave of relief as if I had crossed an invisible barrier into safety, despite the fact that my fear was growing with every minute. A part of me wanted to lift the sheet to make sure everything was normal, but something inside me cried out, "Don't." I quickly unloaded the body, rolled the stretcher into the cold storage room, and then placed it on the metal table. I left the room without turning around and locked the door behind me. That night, I barely slept at all, and every time I closed my eyes, I saw that horrifying smile and those empty eyes staring at me through the rearview mirror. I kept telling myself it had to be an illusion, a trick of exhaustion or stress, but the fear clung to me like a shadow. The following morning, when I arrived at the funeral home, my boss was waiting for me at the entrance. His expression was solemn and his tone accusatory as he asked what happened last night, confused. I recounted the events, omitting the supernatural details, and he listened in silence before speaking. He said in a low voice this morning that the old man didn't want to be moved because it's customary for them to keep the body in the house for 3 days before burial. However, it seems that someone called us early to request a removal, and they were very upset. I asked, my voice shaking, who made the calls. He shrugged. There was no one else in the house when you got there, right? So I shook my head, but deep down I wasn't sure anymore. From that day on, I started to notice odd things around the funeral home. I saw shadows move in the corners of my eye. Every night I worked, the suffocating sense of being watched intensified, and whenever I was given a night shift, it seemed like someone else was with me. Whispers tickled my ears when I was by myself, something that wasn't supposed to be here, and after a few weeks, I couldn't stand it any longer. The discomfort had become an intolerable burden. On the day I resigned, I felt both relieved and afraid, as though I were fleeing something that didn't want me to go. However, years later, the memory of that night still haunts me. On some nights, I wake up abruptly, and occasionally, when I'm driving alone at night, I catch myself looking at the rearview mirror with my heart racing in my chest, afraid that I'll see that smile staring back at me again. I don't want to go. My name is Tyler, and I worked as a hearse driver for a funeral home in Nova for 8 years. It was an odd job, but eventually I got used to the quiet presence of the deceased and the loneliness of driving through deserted roads at night. However, There was one night in particular that signaled the end of my career in that field. An experience I will never forget. One that still makes me wonder if it was real or just the result of a mind pushed to its limits. It was December, one of those chilly nights where the air sliced through you like a knife. According to what I understood, I had been asked to take a woman's body to a small town outside of the city. The deceased had asked to be buried next to her mother in her hometown cemetery. The woman had lived alone in a small apartment with no family to claim her. The only person who came forward was a neighbor who offered to identify the body. Her story, while sad, wasn't out of the ordinary, especially in large cities. I prepared the hearse, secured the casket, and left at around 1 p.m. After a couple of hours of straightforward highway driving, there was a detour onto a rural road. Though they were never pleasant, at least they were uneventful. I had made similar trips numerous times before, but that night was different. As soon as I left the funeral home, I felt a weird pressure in my chest, like something unseen was bearing down on me. In the rear view mirror, the casket appeared to glow dimly under the dim interior light, an unsettling presence that I couldn't ignore, even though I told myself it was just a cold or perhaps the exhaustion from a long shift. Everything was normal until I arrived at the most desolate part of the route, which was a road lined with tall, crooked trees that appeared to lean toward the asphalt, their twisted branches reaching like claws. Suddenly, engines started to sputter. At first, it was just a weird metallic wee, but a few seconds later, the car came to a complete stop. I had experienced mechanical problems with a hearse before, but being stranded in the middle of nowhere with only a coffin was not something I welcomed. I turned off the engine and went outside to look under the hood. That as I opened the hood, I discovered that I had no idea what I was looking for. Normally, the funeral home had a mechanic for these kinds of problems, but out here, I was alone, so I fumbled around acting like I knew what I was doing in an attempt to calm my nerves. The night air was freezing, and the only sound in the silence was a faint rustle of leaves in the wind. I froze when I heard it for the first time, a low, barely audible whisper from behind me that said, "I don't want to go." The voice was clear, feminine, and comfortingly close, as though someone was standing directly behind me. My heart was pounding in my chest. I turned around expecting to see someone, but the road was deserted. The hearse was silent, and the casket was still firmly in place. "It's all in your head." I tried to calm the growing panic by whispering to myself, but as my gaze returned to the hearse, I realized right away that the casket's lid, which I had checked twice before leaving, was now slightly open, just a few inches, but enough to send shivers down my spine. As I moved closer, I heard the crunch of gravel beneath my feet reverberating in the silence. The closer I got, the heavier the air seemed to get, pressing against my chest like an invisible weight. My mind raced for a logical explanation, but I knew deep down that I hadn't sealed it properly before the trip. I always double-checked. My hands trembled as I reached out and pushed the lid back into place after a brief moment of hesitation. I felt resistance from something inside the casket that seemed to push back against me, but I managed to force the lid shut and secure it once more in an attempt to get rid of the dreadful feeling as I made my way back to the front of the hearse and concentrated on starting the engine. However, the pressure in my chest increased, and I couldn't get rid of the feeling that I was being watched. Then, I heard the voice from inside the hearse, louder and clearer this time, saying, "I don't want to go." I gazed upon the hearse. Fear paralyzed me. The voice was unmistakable. It had come from the coffin. My mind cried out that what I had just heard could not be real, but the cold chill that ran down my spine told me otherwise. Gathering what little courage I still had, I approached the car, my hands shaking and my breathing shallow, opening the driver's side door to retrieve my phone. I considered calling anybody. However, as my hand was about to reach for it, there was a loud thud, and the casket's lid fell open completely, slamming onto the hearse's floor. For a moment, everything seemed to stop, and I was unable to move or breathe. I forced myself to turn and look, hoping it was all in my head, but what I saw chilled my blood. The woman who had died only hours before was sitting upright in the coffin. Her mouth moved silently as if she were trying to speak, but nothing came out. Her eyes were wide open, but they weren't normal. They were black like two endless voids that seemed to suck the light out of the area around her. Something seemed to be preventing her from speaking. I staggered backward, almost falling out of the car, and my mind cried out for me to run, but my body wouldn't cooperate. Her head turned slowly in my direction, her lips parted, and I heard the words clearly this time. "I don't want to go." Her voice was strangely low, raspy, and full of hate that wasn't real, and it was enough to shake me out of my daze. Not caring that I had left the door open, I ran blindly into the darkness, desperate to escape, my feet hitting the gravel road. The sound of slow, deliberate footsteps echoed behind me as I ran, giving me the impression that someone was following me. I was afraid to turn around because my lungs were burning and the cold air was cutting my throat, but I kept running because my only goal was to get as far away as I could. Eventually, I noticed headlights and a truck coming from the other direction. I waved my arms frantically and called for help, but the truck skidded to a stop, and the older man who was driving it jumped out, obviously alarmed by my condition, and pointing back toward the hearse. The man calmed me down enough to help me piece together what had happened, and after some hesitation, he agreed to drive me back to the hearse where I had left it. My hands were shaking the whole way, but when we got there, the hearse was exactly as I had left it. The back door was still open, the casket was still there, but the lid was closed, just like it had been at the start of the trip. I felt a cold knot of fear as I approached. Wondering if I had imagined it all, the driver gave me a look that made it obvious he thought I was either insane or sleep-deprived. I didn't try to persuade him otherwise. We secured the casket one last time, and I drove directly to the cemetery without stopping. When I got there, the cemetery caretaker was waiting for me. The casket was securely closed, and everything appeared normal, but I knew what I had seen and heard. I returned to the car and drove away as quickly as I could. After giving the coffin to the caretaker, I quit my job the following day, and I never went back to the funeral home or drove a hearse again. Years later, I still question whether what happened that night was real or if my mind was playing tricks on me, but occasionally late at night, I hear a whisper so soft that it seems like it's coming from inside my own head, and I don't want to go. In those moments, I know that the memory of that night will never leave me. It will always follow me, like the shadow of the woman who refused to remain in her grave. Lifeless eyes. In 1991, I was 24 years old and working as an assistant at a small funeral home in a small rural San Diego town. I didn't choose this job out of passion, but rather out of necessity, and over time, I thought I had gotten used to the long shifts and the constant sadness that surrounded it. However, nothing could have prepared me for what happened on a cold November night, a night that left a scar on my life that has never healed. The day we received the body of a man who had died in a car accident. My job was to prepare the body for the viewing scheduled for the next day. On the surface, it was just another routine task, but something about the body unnerved me from the start. He was about 40 years old, tall and thin, with a long face and dark eyes that seemed to hold a secret. The coroner didn't give many details, only stating that the impact had been brutal and that death was almost instantaneous. His eyes were wide open and staring blankly at the embalming room ceiling, which disturbed me the most. His skin was pale, almost waxy, but it still felt warm to the touch, as if death had barely touched him. A strange uneasiness crept over me. It felt like those eyes didn't want to lose sight of their surroundings. After a few frustrating minutes, I decided to wrap his face with a bandage, making sure that the eyes were covered. I tried to close his eyes carefully, just like I had done countless times before placing my fingers gently on his eyelids. I tried to slide them shut, but no matter how many times I tried or how much pressure I applied, they wouldn't stay closed. The rest of the day went smoothly, and I quickly finished the preparations and moved the body to the cold storage room in preparation for the viewing. That evening, I stayed later than usual because my boss was out of town, so I was left in charge of locking up the funeral home. I went through the dimly lit hallways, turning off the lights and making sure everything was in order. The embalming room, with its cold walls and metallic smell, was the last place I checked before leaving. So I locked the door and went to the lobby to get my belongings just before doing so. From the rear of the building came a sharp, loud noise that sounded like a purposeful, rhythmic knock. With my heart pounding, I froze in place. When the knocking continued, this time louder and more persistent, and I realized that it was coming from the cold storage room, I initially assumed it might be a technical problem. However, I tried to convince myself that it was simply the wind or perhaps a tool that had fallen. As I slowly moved toward the cold storage room, my heart pounded because I had heard tales of temperature changes in refrigeration units producing odd noises. But this wasn't a creak or a hum. Rather, it was a purposeful, rhythmic knocking that sounded like someone tapping from inside. When I got to the door, I hesitated because the knocks had stopped, leaving an eerie silence that only made the air feel thicker with trembling hands. Every step felt heavier than the last, and the silence around me amplified the sound of my own breathing. When I pushed the door open after unlocking it, the cold air struck me like a slap, and the smell of formaldehyde was more overpowering than usual. At first, everything appeared to be in order, as the bodies were lying on their geas covered in white sheets. However, as I was about to leave, I noticed something in the corner of my eye. Slowly, I froze. I looked toward the far corner of the room and saw the man from the accident standing next to his gurney. His body was still covered by the sheet, but his face was exposed, with the bandage I had carefully placed around his eyes hanging loosely around his neck and his dark, lifeless eyes staring straight at me. I was immobile, though my body already knew this was impossible. He was a corpse, his chest didn't rise or fall, and he wasn't breathing. My mind raced, trying to come up with a rational explanation, but he was standing there as though he were still alive. I felt panicked. When he took a step toward me, I tried to run back to scream, but my legs wouldn't cooperate. The sound of his bare feet on the cold floor echoed through the room like a mob drum beat. But then I noticed something even more horrifying. He wasn't moving naturally. Instead, his limbs were bent at strange angles, as if an invisible force was controlling his body. When he was just a few feet away, he raised one hand and pointed a bony finger directly at my face. His mouth opened slowly as if to speak, but no words came out. Instead, a low, guttural sound escaped his throat like a whisper dragged up from the earth. I tried telling myself that the fear was all in my head and that my fatigue and the eerie atmosphere of the funeral home had tricked me. But every time I closed my eyes that night, I saw those dark, unblinking eyes staring back at me. My mind replayed the sound of the knocks, the strange way he moved, and that guttural whisper. On the verge of losing my mind, I called my boss the following morning to inform him that I was leaving. I didn't give any explanations, and to my surprise, he didn't inquire as to whether he could sense the fear I was carrying or hear the tremor in my voice. After packing, I left town. Even now, decades later, when the world is quiet and I'm alone in the dark, I sometimes feel his eyes on me. No matter where I am, that feeling always finds me. Some nights, I hear faint knocking that is rhythmic and unmistakable. I tell myself it's nothing, but deep down I know the truth. Those eyes never close, and it feels like they're still watching me, waiting for the right moment. For years, I tried to forget about that night, telling myself it was a cruel mental trick. The smiling casket. In 2010, I was employed in Orlando as a casket driver. At first, the routes were routine, monotonous, and almost mechanical. But one night changed everything for me. It began like any other shift we had been assigned to, transporting the body of a 73-year-old woman who had passed away in a small coastal town. The hearse was prepared, and the casket was loaded into the back. I had accepted the job without giving it much thought because the pay was decent and I liked the quiet of nighttime drives. Prior to arriving at a rural cemetery in the small community of St. Adam's Hollow, the route was a lengthy stretch of desolate highway that cut through miles of dense forest. Even though I had previously driven a similar route, something about this evening felt strange. I departed shortly before sunset, and the first few hours went by without incident. The engine ran smoothly, the air conditioner kept the cabin cool, and the faint glow of stars appeared in the clear evening sky. However, as I continued driving down the highway, I saw a storm forming on the horizon, and the sky quickly grew darker. When the rain started, I thought it was just another small annoyance, but then I noticed something odd. The rain didn't fall consistently. It would pour heavily for a minute, then abruptly stop, only to return moments later with renewed force. It was as if the sky itself couldn't decide whether it wanted to unleash its fury or remain still. And an eerie stillness seemed to settle over the forest. It wasn't the usual quiet of nighttime. It was heavier, almost oppressive. Like the world itself was holding its breath. I switched on the high beams to improve my vision of the road ahead, but the light barely made it through the dense forest that surrounded the highway. At that moment, car radio suddenly turned on, and a burst of static filled the cabin, crackling loudly and breaking the silence. I thought the storm might have caused something, but no matter what button I pressed, the static continued, and through the static, I could hear their voices. At first, they were faint, almost inaudible, like whispers echoing from a far-off location, but over time, they became louder and more distinct. The voices sent a shiver down my spine. They rose and fell in strange rhythms that overlapped in ways that felt unnatural, as if multiple people were speaking in unison but out of sync. They sounded like chants or prayers, but I couldn't understand the language. It wasn't English, Spanish, or any other language. I knew it was something ancient, something primordial. I attempted to turn off the radio, but the voices persisted, faint but persistent, as if emanating from inside the hearse itself. Then I heard my name, Robert. A woman's voice whispered, cold and emotionless but perfectly clear. I froze, clutching the steering wheel so firmly that my knuckles turned white. My heart was racing as I looked around the road and the forest in search of some logical explanation, but all I could see was a never-ending highway and the rain beating on the windshield. Robert. I decided to pull over because the rain had gotten worse and the road was dangerously slick, and I felt my stomach drop when the voice repeated louder this time. There couldn't have been anyone else in the hearse with me, or at least they shouldn't have been desperate to get out of the growing sense of dread. I tried to stop my racing thoughts by turning off the engine and sitting there for a while, but the air inside the hearse felt heavier, almost suffocating. And then I felt an unmistakable weight in the passenger seat. Next to me, I slowly turned my head, and every instinct in my body told me not to look. The seat was empty, or at least it seemed so, but the leather was creased as if someone or something was sitting there, and I could hear a faint sound of fabric shifting, and I could feel my heart racing. I wanted to think that this was all in my head, but perhaps the storm and exhaustion were deceiving me. My breath caught in my throat when I looked at the rear-view mirror. The casket's lid, which had been tightly closed, was now slightly open, and I was frozen in place, unable to take my eyes off of it. The casket was open just enough to reveal the dark interior, an abyss that appeared to swallow the dim light of van when I stepped out of the hearse into the pouring rain. I mustered all my courage and tried to convince myself that I had secured it incorrectly before leaving, but I knew that wasn't true. The cold water immediately soaked me, but the feeling of ice in my chest had nothing to do with the weather. I took a deep breath, grabbed the handle, and swung the doors open. The casket sat there exactly as I had left it, save for the lid, which was now completely open. My flashlight beam illuminated the inside, and for a moment I wished I hadn't looked. I walked slowly to the back of the car, holding a flashlight in one shaking hand. The rain made everything slick, and the tree branches swayed violently in the wind, as if they were reaching out to me. The old woman's head was turned toward me, but her body remained. Her eyes were open and staring straight at me when they should have been closed. Her mouth was open a little. Her body started to move slowly and strangely as I stared in horror. Her limbs jerked as if being pulled by invisible strings, and she sat up, her head lolling to one side, those lifeless eyes never leaving mine. I staggered back, almost dropping the flashlight, frozen in what appeared to be a grimace of pain or terror. No, the words didn't sound like they came from her. Rather, They seemed to come from everywhere at once, filling the air around me. That was all I needed to break out of my paralysis. I whispered, shaking my head as if denying it would stop it. Her mouth opened wider, and I heard the voice again. "Let me out," she said, though her lips hardly moved. I scampered back to the driver's seat, slamming the door shut as I turned and scampered my feet on the wet ground. I struggled with the keys, my hands shaking, making it almost impossible to start the engine. When I eventually got the hearse running, I dared not glance at the rear-view mirror. I pressed the gas pedal in a desperate attempt to get out of that spot. The rain beat down on the windshield, and the wipers struggled to keep up. The road ahead was a blur, but I didn't care. I just needed to keep going. However, no matter how fast I drove, the oppressive sensation of being watched persisted. Then I heard the knocking, which began as a faint tap coming from the back of the hearse. I gripped the steering wheel harder, my knuckles white, and the knocking became louder and more persistent until it sounded as though someone was hammering on the inside of the coffin. Each thud sent a shockwave through me, but I couldn't stop as I pushed the accelerator harder and kept my eyes on the road ahead. The lights of the cemetery finally came into view. A wave of relief passed over me. But it was brief because the knocking stopped suddenly as I pulled into the cemetery's narrow gates. The silence that followed was even more terrifying, as if the air itself was holding its breath. "Let me out," the voice said again. Louder this time, the caretaker at the cemetery was waiting for me, standing next to a freshly dug grave. I parked the hearse, got out, and walked to the back, trembling. I tried not to look at him as we unloaded the casket. If he did, he didn't say anything. However, as soon as we put it next to the grave, I felt the unbearable pressure on my chest again, and my eyes darted to the casket. I noticed that the lid, which had been sealed moments before, was now slightly open. I stepped back, shaking my head. Unable to speak, the caregiver gave me a perplexed look before stooping to examine it. When he fully opened the lid, his face turned pale and he said, "She's smiling," in a barely audible whisper. The following day, I quit my job. I never told anyone what happened that night, and I've never been in a hearse again, but occasionally late at night, I can still hear that voice. It's a whisper, not a loud one. As I ran back to the hearse, my heart thumping in my ears. I didn't care about the storm or speed limits. All I wanted was to get out of that cemetery and whatever was in that casket. I quit my job the following day. Never told anyone what had happened that evening, and I've never been in a hearse again, but occasionally late at night, I can still hear that voice. It's only a whisper, but it always says, "Let me out."